He bought the $600,000 dream home with his own money, but one shocking afternoon his own son pointed to the front door and said, "Become my wife's servant, or get out." What looked like a cruel family betrayal was actually part of a far darker plan that had been unfolding in secret for months. If you enjoy emotional family dramas with shocking twists and satisfying justice, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next story. The first time my own son looked me straight in the eyes and said, "Become my wife's servant, or get out of this house," I honestly thought I had misunderstood him. The words echoed through the spacious living room of the $600,000 lakeside home that I had purchased with the savings from 3 decades of hard work. Every wall, every beam, every floorboard reminded me of the countless construction projects I had managed throughout my career. Yet at that moment none of it seemed to belong to me anymore. My name is Bruno Creston, and this is the story of how trust can disappear long before ownership does. 3 years earlier, life had looked completely different. After retiring as a structural engineer, I decided it was finally time to stop chasing deadlines and start living at my own pace. I searched for months before finding the perfect property overlooking Cedar Lake. It wasn't just another expensive house. It represented every sacrifice I had made over the years, every holiday I had skipped, every weekend I had spent inspecting construction sites instead of relaxing with friends. When I signed the final paperwork, I believed I had secured a peaceful future for myself. The house was exactly what I had dreamed of. Large glass windows overlooked the calm water. A spacious workshop stood behind the garage where I planned to restore old furniture, a hobby I had postponed for years. The backyard stretched toward a private dock where I imagined quiet mornings with coffee before sunrise. Every detail reflected the simple life I wanted after decades of responsibility. About a year later, I met Celine Vos Arden during a charity event supporting retired veterans. She appeared thoughtful, intelligent, and remarkably patient. Unlike many people I had encountered after retirement, she never asked about my investments or properties. Instead, she listened carefully whenever I talked about architecture, engineering, or woodworking. That alone earned my respect. As our relationship developed, she repeatedly insisted that financial independence was important for both of us. She even encouraged me to keep every legal document under my own name. Looking back now, that advice became one of the biggest reasons I trusted her completely. I convinced myself that someone who refused control over my assets could never have hidden intentions. After we married, life settled into a comfortable routine. We hosted neighborhood dinners, spent weekends walking around the lake, and welcomed visiting relatives during holidays. Friends often told me how fortunate I was to find companionship later in life. I agreed with them. For a while, I genuinely believed I had received a second chance at happiness. Then the changes began. None of them were dramatic enough to raise immediate concern. A folder containing utility contracts suddenly appeared in a different cabinet. The housekeeper politely informed me that Celine preferred handling weekly schedules herself. Maintenance appointments I normally supervised had already been arranged without my knowledge. Whenever I asked simple questions, someone always answered before I had the chance to finish speaking, as if every decision had quietly moved beyond my reach. I blamed retirement. I assumed I had simply become less involved in daily routines. After all, married couples naturally divide responsibilities over time. That explanation sounded reasonable, and I accepted it without much thought. Several weeks later, my son arrived for what I expected would be a pleasant weekend visit. I hadn't seen him in nearly 2 months, so I looked forward to catching up over dinner. As his car pulled into the driveway, I walked outside with a smile, ready to welcome him home. He stepped out, carried his travel bag across the driveway, and walked directly past me. Without hesitation, he embraced Celine first. Only after several uncomfortable seconds did he glance in my direction and offer a brief nod instead of the warm hug we had always shared. At that moment, I felt something I couldn't quite explain. It wasn't anger. It wasn't disappointment. It was the quiet realization that something inside my own family had changed while I wasn't paying attention. I ignored that feeling because I believed trust deserved the benefit of the doubt. I would soon discover that ignoring the smallest warning can become the most expensive mistake a person ever makes. The atmosphere inside the house shifted almost immediately after my son's arrival. During dinner, the conversations that had once flowed naturally became strangely rehearsed. Celine answered questions before I could. My son agreed with nearly everything she said. even when the subject involved decisions I had personally made years earlier. I watched quietly, convincing myself that I was simply overthinking ordinary family dynamics. The following morning, I walked into the kitchen expecting my usual cup of coffee. Instead, I found Celine reorganizing every cabinet while my son sat comfortably at the dining table scrolling through his phone. "Good morning," I said with a smile. Neither of them looked surprised to see me. "Morning," my son replied without lifting his eyes. Celine smiled politely before placing a printed sheet of paper in front of me. "I've been thinking about making the household more organized," she said calmly. "Everyone should have responsibilities." I looked down at the paper. There was a weekly schedule. Laundry every Monday. Kitchen cleaning every Tuesday. Garden maintenance every Thursday. Preparing breakfast every Saturday. At first, I assumed it was some kind of joke. I laughed softly. "You already hired professionals for all of this," I reminded her. "We don't need schedules." Her smile never disappeared. "We don't anymore." That answer caught my attention. "What do you mean?" "I let them go." I stared at her. "You fired the staff?" "They were unnecessary expenses." I frowned. "We've had them for years. They understood this house better than anyone." She folded her hands together. "This is our home now, Bruno. We should take care of it ourselves." Something about the way she emphasized the word "our" felt unusual. Before I could continue the conversation, my son finally looked up. "I actually think she's right." His voice sounded firm. "We've all become too dependent on other people." I blinked. "You've been here less than 24 hours. He shrugged. "That doesn't mean I can't recognize good ideas." The conversation ended there, but my thoughts didn't. Later that afternoon, I noticed another unexpected change. The security system password no longer worked. I entered it twice. The panel rejected it both times. When I asked Celine about it, she answered casually, "I updated the codes yesterday." "You forgot to tell me?" "I didn't forget." She continued arranging flowers on the dining table without looking at me. I just hadn't had the chance. I waited for her to hand me the new password. She never did. For the first time since buying the property, I couldn't even access the security controls inside my own house. Over the next several days, similar incidents kept happening. The garage keypad had been changed. The smart home application on my phone suddenly displayed an authorization error. Packages addressed to me were already opened before I saw them. Even the financial mail I normally reviewed every Friday had disappeared from my office desk. Whenever I asked questions, the answers were always polite but strangely incomplete. It was already handled. I forgot to mention it. It wasn't important. Those phrases became so common that I almost stopped asking altogether. What disturbed me most wasn't Celine's behavior. It was my son's complete support for every decision she made. One evening, I found him helping her rearrange my workshop. My carefully organized woodworking tools had been moved into labeled storage bins. Blueprints from projects I had completed years ago were stacked in random boxes. "Please don't move those," I said. "I know exactly where everything belongs." My son stopped what he was doing. "You don't use this stuff anymore." "I still do." "Not really." I walked toward the workbench. "I built this workspace myself." Celine stepped beside him. "We're only trying to modernize it." "I didn't ask anyone to modernize it." Silence filled the room. Then my son crossed his arms. His expression had become cold, almost unfamiliar. "Dad," he said slowly, "things can't always stay the way you want." I looked directly at him. "What exactly is that supposed to mean?" He took one step closer. "It means this house isn't just about you anymore." Those words stayed with me long after the conversation ended. For days, I replayed them in my mind, trying to understand why my own son suddenly spoke as though I were an outsider living under someone else's roof. I still believed there had to be a reasonable explanation. I had no idea that the worst moment of my life was only days away. 2 mornings later, everything changed. I came downstairs expecting another uncomfortable breakfast, but the dining room had been transformed into what looked like a family meeting. Celine sat at the head of the table with a leather notebook open in front of her. My son was seated beside her with his arms folded. Several folders lay neatly arranged across the polished wooden surface. The atmosphere felt less like a home and more like a boardroom. "Bruno, have a seat," Celine said with a pleasant smile. Her voice was calm, almost welcoming, but something about it made me uneasy. I remained standing. What is this about? We've been discussing how to improve the harmony in this household. I looked toward my son. You've only been here for a few days. He nodded without hesitation. That's been long enough. I slowly pulled out a chair and sat down. Celine slid another printed document toward me. This is a simple household agreement. I picked it up. The first page listed rules. Every decision regarding guests required Celine's approval. Household expenses would be managed exclusively by her. My workshop could only be used during approved hours. Any renovations or purchases required consultation with both of them. I kept reading. The final page stopped me cold. It required my signature. I looked up. You actually expect me to sign this? Celine answered before my son could speak. It will reduce unnecessary disagreements. I placed the papers back onto the table. No. Her smile faded only slightly. Would you explain why? Because I bought this house. My voice remained steady. I've spent years maintaining it. I'm not asking permission to live in my own home. For several seconds nobody spoke. Then my son leaned forward. His expression was completely different from the man I had raised. His eyes held no warmth. No one is asking permission, he said. We're asking for cooperation. This isn't cooperation. It's respect. I shook my head. No. Respect goes both ways. Celine quietly closed her notebook. I think you're making this more difficult than necessary. I stood. The conversation is over. As I turned toward the hallway, my son's voice stopped me. Lunch is at 1. I looked back. So, if you're staying here, everyone eats together. I stared at him. I've eaten in my own study for years. Not anymore. His answer came so quickly that it sounded rehearsed. The rest of the day felt strangely tense. Every room seemed quieter than usual. Even the familiar sounds of the lake outside couldn't settle my thoughts. That evening, I walked into my office intending to review property maintenance invoices. The filing cabinet was locked. I searched every drawer for the spare key. It was gone. When I asked Celine where it was, she answered without looking up from her tablet. I put all the important documents somewhere safer. Where? They're secure. I asked where. She finally raised her eyes. I'll retrieve them whenever they're needed. That answer angered me more than I expected. They're my documents. They're family documents now. Before I could respond, my son entered the room. He looked from me to Celine and sighed. Can we please stop arguing? I'm not arguing, I replied. I'm asking a simple question. He walked closer until we were standing only a few feet apart. You're making Mom feel uncomfortable. I frowned. Mom. He hadn't called Celine that before. Not once. The word echoed inside my head. I suddenly realized how quickly his loyalty had shifted. I took a slow breath. She's your stepmother. She's family. So am I. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced towards Celine as if waiting for approval before speaking. That silent exchange told me more than words ever could. Later that night, I couldn't sleep. I walked through the dark hallway toward the kitchen for a glass of water. As I passed the living room, I noticed light coming from beneath the closed library door. Voices drifted through the narrow opening. I recognized Celine's voice immediately. He's resisting more than I expected. Then my son answered. So what do we do now? There was a brief pause. Celine spoke again, her tone calm and calculated. Pressure works better when someone feels alone. I stood motionless outside the door. Every instinct told me to walk in. Instead, I stayed silent and listened. A few seconds later, chairs scraped across the floor. I stepped away from the doorway just before it opened. Neither of them saw me standing in the shadows of the hallway. The following afternoon, everything finally exploded. Standing in the middle of the living room with sunlight pouring through the tall windows I had chosen years earlier, my son pointed toward the front door and spoke the words that would forever change our relationship. Become Celine's servant, or get out of this house. For a moment I couldn't even breathe. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything I had ever experienced. I wish I could tell you that I argued with my son after he gave me that impossible choice. I didn't. I simply looked at him, then at Celine, who stood quietly beside him with an expression that almost resembled sympathy. He never smiled. He didn't need to. The confidence in her eyes told me she believed she had already won. I took a slow breath and asked one question. If I leave, will that make both of you happy? My son answered first. It will make this family peaceful again. Family. The word sounded empty coming from him. Without another sentence, I turned around and walked upstairs. Every step across the hardwood floor reminded me that I had personally approved every design choice when the house was built. The staircase, the lighting, the custom bookshelves, the workshop in the backyard. I had planned every detail because I expected to grow old here. Now I was packing a suitcase like an unwelcome visitor. I filled one bag with clothes, another with personal notebooks, and a small box containing old photographs of my late parents. I reached for a framed picture of my son when he was 10 years old. We had spent an entire summer building a wooden fishing boat together. I stared at the picture for several seconds before carefully wrapping it in a sweater. There were no angry footsteps behind me. No one tried to stop me. No one asked me to stay. When I carried my luggage downstairs, Celine stood beside the front entrance. I hope someday you'll understand why this was necessary, she said quietly. I looked directly at her. I don't think I know you at all. She lowered her eyes but never answered. Outside, the afternoon air felt strangely cold despite the clear sky. I loaded my belongings into my truck, started the engine, and drove away from the house I had spent years dreaming about. I never looked back through the rearview mirror. Instead of staying with relatives, I rented a furnished apartment in the downtown business district. It overlooked busy streets instead of calm water, but privacy mattered more than comfort. For the first few days, I barely unpacked anything. I spent hours replaying every conversation from the past year, searching for the exact moment everything had begun to change. Had I ignored obvious warning signs? Had I trusted too easily? The questions never stopped. What surprised me most was the silence. Neither Celine nor my son called. No text messages. No emails. No explanation. It was as though I had disappeared from their lives overnight. After nearly 2 weeks, I stopped expecting anyone to contact me. Instead, I focused on something I understood better than emotions. Records. Throughout my engineering career, I had developed a habit of keeping copies of everything. Construction contracts, inspection reports, maintenance schedules, insurance renewals, warranty information. I archived documents so carefully that former colleagues used to joke I could reconstruct an entire building using paperwork alone. One rainy afternoon, I opened several storage boxes I had brought from the house. Inside were binders containing years of property records. At first, everything looked normal. Utility payments had been made on time. Insurance premiums were current. Property taxes were fully paid. Nothing suggested financial trouble. So something felt wrong. So I organized every invoice by date instead of category. That simple decision revealed something unexpected. About 9 months earlier, service providers had begun changing one by one. The landscaping company I had trusted for years disappeared from the records. A different contractor replaced them. Then the cleaning service changed. After that, the security monitoring company. Next came plumbing inspections, electrical maintenance, even seasonal dock repairs. Every familiar business had quietly been replaced. At first glance, the companies appeared unrelated. Different names, different addresses, different contact numbers. But as I compared payment details more carefully, I noticed an unusual pattern. Every invoice instructed payments to different businesses. Yet every transfer ultimately arrived at the same financial institution, the same branch office, and accounts opened within weeks of one another. That wasn't ordinary business practice. I highlighted every payment and spread the papers across my apartment floor. Hours passed before I finally reached a conclusion. Someone had deliberately redirected nearly every long-term service connected to my property. Not all at once. Slowly, carefully, patiently. The changes were so gradual that almost nobody would have noticed them. Almost nobody except someone who had spent decades reviewing technical documents line by line. For the first time since leaving the house, I no longer believed the situation was only about control inside my marriage. There was a much larger plan hiding beneath the surface. And I had just uncovered the first piece of it. For the next 3 days, my apartment looked less like a place to live and more like an investigation room. Every available surface was covered with folders, invoices, maintenance reports, and handwritten notes. I arranged documents by date, contractor, payment amount, and account number. The pattern became clearer every hour. Whoever had reorganized the service network around my house hadn't acted randomly. Every replacement had been planned months in advance. I decided that guessing was no longer enough. I needed proof. Instead of hiring a private detective, I contacted someone I had worked with years earlier on a commercial fraud investigation involving forged construction permits. His name was Adrian Salvik. He specialized in corporate forensic analysis, tracing financial relationships that ordinary audits often missed. When I explained my situation over the phone, he remained silent for several moments. Finally, he asked one question. "Bruno, do you want reassurance or do you want the truth?" "The truth." "Then don't contact anyone involved until I finish." The following morning, Adrian arrived carrying nothing more than a laptop, a portable scanner, and a notebook. He spent nearly 6 hours reviewing every document I had collected. He rarely spoke. Occasionally he circled a company name or wrote a short note in the margin of a report. By late afternoon he leaned back in his chair. "You were right." I looked at him. "So there is a connection?" "There are several." He rotated the laptop toward me. A digital chart appeared on the screen. At first glance it looked like a spider web. Lines connected one company to another. Ownership records crossed through holding firms. Business registrations overlapped. "The companies look independent," Adrian explained, "but they're linked through administrative filings." He enlarged one section. "They all use the same document preparation service." Then another. "They also share nearly identical filing schedules." Finally, he opened the corporate ownership records. Every company listed a different director, different addresses, different phone numbers. But every registration pointed toward one controlling business entity. Its name appeared in bold letters across the top of the screen. Magnus Ellery Cade Holdings. I frowned. I've never heard of him. Neither had I. Adrian continued searching public records. There were almost no interviews. No social media presence. Very little business history. The entire corporate structure had appeared less than 2 years earlier. It was unusually clean. Almost too clean. "Can you find him?" I asked. "I'll try." 2 days later Adrian called. "Meet me at my office." His voice sounded different, less confident. When I arrived, several new documents were waiting on his desk. I located Magnus. And he isn't what we expected. According to employment records, Magnus Ellery Cade worked as a mechanical engineer nearly 200 miles away. His salary was modest. He owned no luxury properties, no expensive vehicles. Nothing suggested he controlled multiple businesses. "That makes no sense," I said. "It gets stranger." Adrian slid another document toward me. Magnus had reported identity theft nearly 18 months earlier. The police report described unauthorized business registrations opened without his knowledge. My heartbeat slowed. So he's not running these companies? It doesn't appear that way. Then who is? Adrian folded his hands. That's the question. Over the next week he expanded the investigation. The answer finally appeared in an unexpected place. Not inside financial records. Not inside corporate databases. Inside legal filings. Every company had been established through the same small law office located in another county. Different business names. Different registration dates. One identical administrative contact. A legal assistant named Leora Quintus Hale. Adrian looked directly at me. "I think she's the key." We requested copies of every available filing connected to her work. Most appeared ordinary. Routine paperwork. Standard signatures. Nothing unusual. Until Adrian compared the digital timestamps. Nearly every document had been prepared outside normal business hours. Some were created after midnight. Others during weekends when the office was officially closed. Someone had been using the law office without following ordinary procedures. Adrian contacted local investigators, who arranged to interview Leora. I expected her to deny everything. Instead, less than 24 hours later, Adrian called again. "Bruno," she talked. "What did she say?" "Not much." My stomach tightened. "But before asking for a lawyer." He paused. She handed investigators a small encrypted flash drive and said only one sentence. "Everything you need is inside." At that moment, I realized the truth was no longer hidden behind suspicion. It was waiting inside that tiny device. The only question left was whether I was ready to see just how deep the betrayal really went. The encrypted flash drive sat on Adrian Solvik's desk like an ordinary piece of plastic, yet both of us understood it could change everything. Investigators had obtained permission to examine its contents, and because the files were directly connected to my financial records, Adrian was allowed to review the evidence with me present. I wasn't sure what I expected to find. Secret bank accounts, perhaps. Hidden contracts. Maybe emails discussing my property. What I discovered was far more disturbing. The first folder contained hundreds of audio recordings. Every file was labeled with a date and time. Most lasted only a few minutes. Adrian clicked on the earliest recording. Celine's voice immediately filled the room. "Don't move too quickly," she said calmly. "If everything changes at once, Bruno will notice. We need him to believe every adjustment is his own idea." My hands tightened around the armrests of the chair. There was no doubt. It was her voice. Another recording began. This time she spoke with Leora Quintas Hale. "The companies don't need real operations," Celine explained. "They only need believable paperwork. By the time anyone checks the ownership trail, we'll already control every service connected to the property." I stared at the speakers without saying a word. For months I had questioned my own judgment. Now every suspicion was being confirmed. Adrian continued opening file after file. The evidence became even more detailed. There were scanned contracts with revision histories, emails discussing contractor replacements, calendars showing carefully planned meetings, lists of utility providers that needed to be changed one at a time. Nothing had been accidental. Everything had followed a schedule. Then we found a folder simply labeled Behavior. Inside were handwritten notes converted into digital documents. The first page carried my name, Bruno Creston. Below it was a list of observations. Hide paperwork occasionally. Move personal belongings. Change passwords without warning. Answer questions before he finishes asking. Repeat that he forgets things. Encourage others to notice confusion. I felt my stomach sink. They were creating a pattern, Adrian said quietly. So people would think I was losing my memory. He nodded. Exactly. The next recording hurt more than any document. My son's voice could be heard asking a question. What if he's just being stubborn? Celine answered without hesitation. Stubbornness is easy to confuse with cognitive decline. Keep correcting him in front of other people. Eventually he'll begin questioning himself. I closed my eyes. For months I had wondered why every conversation ended with someone insisting I had forgotten something. It hadn't been coincidence. It had been rehearsed. The manipulation wasn't directed only at me. It was aimed at everyone around me. Adrian paused the recording. Listen carefully to your son's tone. I replayed the conversation. There was frustration in his voice. There was concern. But there was no excitement. No greed. No celebration. He genuinely sounded worried. He believed her, I whispered. I think he did. That realization changed everything. Until that moment I had blamed both of them equally. Now I understood that my son had never been the architect of this plan. He had become another target. Celine had spent months convincing him that I was slowly becoming incapable of managing my own affairs. Every misplaced document, every changed password, every interrupted conversation, every staged misunderstanding, they were all pieces of the same performance. If enough people accepted that I was mentally declining, then any objection I raised would appear to be proof instead of defense. Adrian opened the final folder. It contained video clips recorded with a hidden camera inside my own house. One clip showed Celine secretly moving my property tax folder into a different cabinet before I entered the room looking for it. Another captured her unlocking my office late at night and removing maintenance files. A third recording showed her changing the security system password while speaking on the phone. Tomorrow he'll try the old code, she said with complete confidence. When it fails, tell him he already approved the update weeks ago. I remembered that exact conversation. For the first time since leaving my home, every confusing moment suddenly made perfect sense. The lies had never depended on convincing me. They depended on convincing everyone else that I could no longer trust my own memory. Adrian slowly closed the laptop. The The evidence is overwhelming. I nodded, but my thoughts weren't on the recordings anymore. They were on my son. If Celine had manipulated him this completely, confronting her in private would accomplish nothing. The truth needed witnesses. Real witnesses. And in that moment I began planning something she would never see coming.